The following is a presentation of the University of St. Thomas with campuses in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's alumni webinar. I'm here with Dr. Chris Michaelson, who's going to talk about his work and research on meaningful work. He'll present for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. And you can submit questions for Dr. Michaelson by using the Q&A function on the bottom of your window there, or submitting questions in the chat. So without further ado, Dr. Michaelson, take it away.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to everybody on the line. It is great to be able to reconnect with those of you who were in my classes, and for those of you who weren't. I hope that after this hour, you wish that you were, or that at least you get something out of this. I want to wish you a happy Friday. Happy Friday. Have you thought about what we imply when we wish somebody a happy Friday? Sometimes what we're implying is that we're looking forward to the beautiful weather that we're having in St. Paul today, for example, but oftentimes we're also thinking, yeah, and I survived the work week. I survived. And that's not really the best way to get through life, surviving. We want to thrive. And in a sense, if you don't have time to listen to the full hour of this conversation, you can just leave now, because that's the essential substance of this talk. That we shouldn't just survive the week, and that we should seek to thrive through not only the life we live, but also the work we do. So there's a little bit of bad news to this conversation, because too many of us feel like we just survive the work week. There's also a little bit of sad news that I'll share to illustrate some of the points that I'm hoping we can think and talk about. But there's also good news as well. And that good news is implied in this title, that you can discover meaningful work. So let's talk about this picture on this title slide. If you don't recognize it, then I'll clue you in. That's Tom Sawyer and a kid in the neighborhood. And this is maybe one of the most famous scenes in American literature. It's Saturday morning, a beautiful Saturday morning, when Tom would like nothing better than to say, go fishing, go play. But Aunt Polly has sentenced him to a full day of whitewashing an enormous fence. It's much longer than the fence that you see in this picture. And Polly has sentenced him to doing this because he came in late the night before. His clothes were torn up. He'd been in a fight with another boy. So the fence needs a good whitewashing anyway, and it's Tom's job to do it. And as he looks at the fence, he thinks what a burden life can be. The other kids are laughing and running by. And then one of them asks what he's doing. And Tom generates this ingenious idea. He thinks, I'm going to make it look really fun. I'm going to pique this kid's curiosity, who's wondering about what I'm doing, and kind of sell it. And so he acts like it's something that's really fun to do, and he's not sure if the kid is qualified to do it. Maybe he'll let him give it a try, but it's going to cost him. And so this kid and all the neighborhood kids who walk by end up paying Tom to whitewash his fence while he sits in a chair and washes them. And by the end of the day, Tom has a pocket full of toys and a fence that has 3 fresh coats of paint on it. And that, in a way, is a very optimistic story. It's one of the solutions to the bad news that we survive the week of work, that you can reframe, rethink, redefine the way that you think about your work as play. In fact, the narrator, in the voice of Mark Twain, of course, says at the end of this chapter that Tom's discovered that work is what we're obligated to do and play is what we're not obligated to do. And if you can just think about work as play, then maybe it doesn't seem so bad at all. That's one way of discovering your meaningful work, but for some of us, it's going to ring a little bit hollow. First of all, we might not be as easy to deceive as the neighborhood kids in Tom Sawyer's neighborhood. But also, there's a dark side to this story, and that is the side in which Tom is sort of a manager of other people, and he's deceiving them into thinking that their work is more meaningful than it is. And in that sense, he's manipulating them to do his bidding without necessarily them fulfilling themselves. And maybe in your workplaces, you hear more and more these days about the purpose of your organization and how it contributes to a life of meaning. And maybe it's true, maybe there's substance to that, but maybe there's some manipulation. But there's a reason that this conversation is happening in our world today. And that reason comes from the bad news. So now I'm going to dip into a little bit more detail about the bad news about meaningful work. First, I'm going to figure out how to advance this slide. There we go. All right. Since 2005, more than half of Americans have been unhappy at work. More than half. And that doesn't even seem like news as bad as this. Only 33% of Americans are engaged at work in the sense that they love their jobs and like making their organization better every day. Look further down and you'll see that there's not only such a thing as being not engaged, but there's actually such a thing as being actively disengaged, trying to undermine the things that the organization does and that the other employees feel. Another irony in this statistic is that this was actually good news when these results came out from Gallup, because 33% was an increase over the year before. The headline in Gallup's news release was that more Americans are engaged at work than previously. Why is this happening? Well, this is not only an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. This thing called the U-bend happens in most affluent markets in which happiness is at its lowest levels during the years in which we earn the most. And you can see why it's called the U-bend, because it looks just like the U-bend in the drain of your toilet. And there might be a metaphor there that people are throwing their lives down the drain during their peak earning years by working so hard that their happiness dips. And so as an antidote to this, we think about all the great things we can do when we're traveling on vacation. And there are books like 101 Places to See Before You Die, and another book says it's 1001 amazing places, another 1000 places. 50 of them you have to see by bicycle. If you can't get out and travel all these places, well, then turn on your television and watch 1001 movies you must see before you die. And while you're watching those movies, maybe you'll cook one of those 1000 foods to eat before you die, 101 of which are Asian. And if you happen to do a pretty poor job of preparing that food, maybe you undercooked the meat, then seek out one of those 101 places to pray before you die. And if that doesn't work, well, at least perhaps you have visited one of the 199 cemeteries to see before you die. But there's no book called this, 1000 Awesome Places to Work Before You Die. If you're near campus, I wish I could go back in time just a few weeks to take you to St. Kate's, where a cast of St. Catherine's and St. Thomas students performed Working, the musical. It was an awesome show based on a book by a journalist named Studs Terkel, who in 1974 interviewed people about what they do all day, and the subtitle goes, how they feel about what they do all day. He interviewed workers from all walks of life: accountants, investment bankers, cleaning people, delivery people, construction workers, and so on. And a lot of them told a similar story to the disengaged, unhappy American worker, but in poetic language that was then sung by the students in the cast of this musical. And one thing that Terkel said in the introduction to his book is that work is a search not just for our daily bread, but also a search for meaning, and in short, for a sort of life rather than a Monday through Friday sort of dying. A Monday through Friday sort of dying, I think, is one of the most important and impressive statements that's been written in American letters. And it's part of the bad news. It's a sad, sad story. So in our Monday through Friday sort of dying, when it's Wednesday, we say to each other, it's hump day. We're getting over the obstacle and are sliding down toward the end of the week. If you did have me as your professor, then you recognize that this is my Bitmoji, my avatar. And the fact that there's actually an iPhone app that you can find these phrases like hump day is just an indicator of how prevalent these views are in our culture. So I started today by saying happy Friday. Sometimes we celebrate quitting time. We always say have a good weekend as we run out the office with our briefcases strewing papers all over the place. And then we run for happy hour to a cheesy restaurant, sorry if you like it, called TGI Fridays. Thank God it's Friday. And do those people in that picture really look happier than you do, where they think it's always Friday and they're drinking their cheap light beer and their fried appetizers? When I was a kid, there was a band called Loverboy, and they rocked it out in pink leather jeans. And one of their most famous songs was called Working for the Weekend. This attitude has been around for a while, and then the weekend is over and we're back to the grind. And we have a sickness that we call the Mondays. And if we say happy Monday, it's just a joke. There's actually a band called the Happy Mondays that has a song called Hallelujah, if you're interested. The same sentiment, more bad news, is prevalent in our attitudes toward whether it's fishing, golfing, or other leisure activities. This phrase is very common in American conversations around the water cooler. A bad day fishing is better than a good day at work. A bad day golfing is better than a good day at work. A bad day doing almost anything, some of us think, is better than a good day at work. And we can buy a wall plaque that says this: a t-shirt, a tank top, a hat, a mug, a lighter, a pin, a sticker. There are a few more reasons why we would rather fish than we'd work. One is boredom. Some of our most affluent workers, asset managers, are bored at work, a majority of them, in fact. Brain waste is one of the reasons that we sometimes get bored. Brain waste is simply underutilizing your brain. And brain waste, sadly, is even more prevalent among immigrants with college degrees that can't get jobs that fully utilize what they studied to do. We also have pressure, and this, again, is not just an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. So in China, over the past 10, 20 years, there's been what some have called the largest migration in human history, workers leaving their ancestral agricultural towns to go to urban environments where there's manufacturing and now high tech. And generally, these unskilled workers moving from country to city are unskilled and slowly develop the skills and the knowledge to work their way up the ladder. But once they make it into the middle class, they're the least happy among Chinese because they now have a burden to live up to. There's pressure to succeed and pressure to make it to the next level. In another affluent market, France, workers have pressed for the right to disconnect from their work communications so that their bosses can't text them or voicemail them or FaceTime them at all hours of the evening and weekend. There are certain hours when employers are prohibited from contacting workers and expecting a response. Otherwise, with our devices, which make our lives more convenient, work can seem omnipresent. All of this omnipresence of work actually leads to potential health problems. They can add to stress, which of course we know is bad for health. That contributes to uncivil behavior. And together, those things can impact health in an adverse way. So that is some bad news, but it's not all bad news. I said there's also sad news and good news, and I'm going to get to a little bit of the good news, I hope, that there's something that we can do about all this meaningless work that's affecting us. I've already shown you a couple of rock bands. I'm going to share, this is a little sad, but a little happy, a picture of a rock star who recently passed away suddenly and surprisingly, Tom Petty. In his last interview in October of 2017 with the LA Times, he didn't know this would be his last interview, but he compared songwriting to fishing. He said, there's either a fish in the boat or there's not. Sometimes you come home and you didn't catch anything, and sometimes you caught a huge fish. But that was the work part of it to me. I just remember being excited when I had a song done. And I knew I had a song in my pocket, and I always felt really excited about it. When Tom Petty sat down for this interview, he was a grandfather, and he was planning to spend more time with his grandchildren. But he was still writing songs, and he was actually going to go on tour. He was still working, even though he was really wealthy from all the hits that he'd produced. He didn't need to work, but he wanted to work. And not every day was a good day of work. Not every day was productive. Some days he would go home without a fish in his pocket. But he always enjoyed the experience of seeing if the fish would bite, which is part of the joy of fishing for many of us. Just being out there, hoping to be productive, seeing if the fish will bite. And some days they do, and some days they don't. But when they do, those days are tremendously satisfying, and they're worth the wait on the days that they don't. So finding this kind of work that feels like a fish in the pocket is one of the goals of meaningful work. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say that working meaningfully enables living meaningfully. What do I mean by that? Well, most human beings, arguably all human beings, want to live a life of meaning. It's a basic human desire to leave an imprint, to not just enjoy ourselves while we're here, not just be happy in a pleasurable sense, but to be happy in a meaningful sense, what ancient Greek philosophers called a eudaimonic sense, a sense of well-being, our own well-being and the well-being of others. But alongside living meaningfully, we have to work. Most of us, at least, are not materially self-sufficient without work. Work is a means to the end of being able to live. And so sometimes we're asked the question, do you live to work or do you work to live? And the right answer to that question, according to the dominant cultural perception, is that we work to make meaningful life possible. And I'm going to challenge that basic assumption and suggest that living to work isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if we're simply workaholics. But living to work, because our work is so meaningful that we can't help but want to do it, is a pretty cool way to work and to live. And given that most of us are going to spend the greatest share of our waking lives as adults working, we might as well discover meaningful work that helps to enable us to live meaningfully, not only as a means to an end, but also as an end in itself. This is David Bowie. He is one more rock star whose story I'm sharing with you, because I believe he worked and lived meaningfully. He did a lot of drugs as a young man. He had a lot of crazy haircuts, and he may not have done those things all over again if he could have done them over again. But he was a creative soul, and he once joked that he really wanted to be remembered for having had some great haircuts. And he was maybe mostly joking when he said that, but maybe he wasn't completely joking, because in those great haircuts was the clue to his creativity, the experimentation in which he engaged, the different personas that he took on, including, you might be aware, Ziggy Stardust, and many others. And in that creativity, he expressed some very important things. I'm not so sure that his last haircut was his best haircut. That's the one in this picture. But I do think that maybe his last album was his best or most innovative album. It was called Black Star, and he began it around a year before he died. He died at age 69. And he released Black Star on his 69th birthday and died 3 days later. A few months before he died, he discovered that his cancer was terminal. But he didn't stop working. He continued putting the finishing touches on his album. It was an arduous task. He'd never worked with jazz musicians before. He was experimenting up until the very end. And then he had to film all these videos that survived him. And in one of the videos, his head is bandaged, and he's lying in a bed that looks like a deathbed. And he's working. And he chose to work until the very end. Not to replace other things that were important to him in his life. Reportedly, he started going home from the studio a little bit earlier when he discovered that his illness was terminal, because he didn't only want to work, he also wanted to live with the people that he loved. But he kept working. And imagine if we could discover our meaningful work, like David Bowie did, in such a way that we wanted to live to work. So how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of advice out there about how to discover meaningful work. You may or may not be able to read the fine print on all of these, but all of these Venn diagrams are quite similar, and quite similar, frankly, to the kinds of things that I've taught in my classes. That meaningful work means a number of things, and sometimes it means different things to different people. But when we find our purpose or our meaningful work, it is probably a combination of things. It feels meaningful to us. We love it in some way. But it also might be something that the world needs us to do. But we can't stop there, because we also have to be good enough at it in order for us to benefit the world's needs. And if we need to work in order to live, then it has to be something for which we can be paid as well. Well, each of those things individually makes sense. That meaningful work is that which you love, that which the world needs, that which you're good at, that which you can be paid for. But can you find all those things in one line of work? That's a pretty tall order. And so while there might be some good news here, that meaningful work is something discoverable, the bad news is that on each of these Venn diagrams, the heart of meaningful work is really, really small in the world of work. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice when we demand that meaningful work has to be all of these things at the same time. So now I'm going to tell some true but sort of sad stories about meaningful work that come from some research in which I am currently engaged with a co-author, Jennifer Toasty-Karras. She's a professor at Babson College, and Jen and I were both management consultants living and working in New York City on 9/11/2001. Not long after 9/11, we were both in academia. She was studying for her PhD. I was in my first academic job as a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And although our experience as management consultants living and working in New York on 9/11 didn't directly lead to us choosing more meaningful work, I think we've both discovered that the work we're doing now feels more meaningful to us than perhaps the work that we did on 9/11. I myself was actually traveling away from my home in downtown Manhattan, where my wife and baby were in our apartment 20 blocks away from the World Trade Center. I was traveling to clients in Washington, D.C., just a few steps away from the White House on 9/11. And I remember thinking, first of all, incredibly fortunate that we were both safe after the attacks, but also feeling a yearning like no other to be back in Manhattan, back with the family that I loved, and wondering, what was it that took me away from my family on this day? And also starting to think about all the victims of those attacks who were away from their families, most of them, when they died. Some of them turned out to be colleagues of mine who were on the planes. Some of them turned out to be acquaintances who were at their offices in the World Trade Center. But all of them were people, nearly all of them were people who had arrived early at work on a Tuesday morning, a beautiful day that turned into a tragic day. And in the days that followed, the New York Times started to publish profiles of the victims based on interviews with their close relations. Those profiles were eventually collected as portraits of grief, about 200-word summaries of the work and lives of the victims of the 9/11 attacks. You can hardly summarize a life in its entirety in 200 words, but every one of these 200-word portraits contains, where available, some information about the person's work, because, as I said before, most of them were at work on 9/11. And it also contains what the reporters interpreted to be the most interesting stories and memories of their close relations from those interviews. And you can see in the faded background of this slide how those portraits were published in the newspaper, 10, 15, 20 in a day. It took many days to publish the portraits of nearly 3,000 victims, approximately 2,500 of which were memorialized in these portraits of grief. And so Jen and I have read and studied with my research associate at St. Thomas, Patty Pravinsky, all of these 2,500 portraits. And we discovered something important, that in their memories of the victims of these attacks, close relations want to remember their loved ones as having died doing something worthwhile. More often than not, when they speak in detail about the work of these people, this work was worthwhile in some way. In a majority of cases, they don't go on at length about work. And we suspect that that is because close relations saw more meaningful things in life than work among those whose work was merely mentioned incidentally. There's a lot of conversation, for example, about making time for family, making time for children, making time for socialization with friends and neighbors, and so on. But in that 1/3 or so of portraits that go into detail about work, I want to share a few stories of how work in each of those domains, that which you love, that which the world needs, that which you are good at, and that which you can be paid for, there is meaning to be discovered in the memories of those who loved these victims. And so perhaps for those of us who are still writing the stories of our lives, maybe there is meaning to be discovered for ourselves. There are many stories, for example, about people working for that which the world needs. Some of them were accountants. A quiet hero, Francis X. Deming, who worked hard, just like the workaday American who is never celebrated. The world needs our work. If you think about the market, it's an imperfect but pretty impressive way of coordinating the world's supply with its demand. And in that way, workaday Americans are doing what the world needs. More specifically, though, a receptionist who was not only answering telephones and greeting people who came in, but she was a relationship therapist for the women in her office. A security guard who was working at a security desk, helping people, just like the firefighters who were more concerned about others than they were about their own safety. Keith Roy Maynard, a minority firefighter in a fire department of New York City that was largely white and male, it meant something to him that he was one of the few Black firefighters in the department who could serve as a symbol of upward mobility for others like him. Even financiers who were teaching people the market, which, as I said before, coordinates supply with demand, found meaning in the world, in satisfying the world's needs. One more in that category, a trader who is using trading activity in the commodity markets to encourage the reduction of greenhouse gases. We can't know these victims through these brief portraits completely, but these are how close relations seen through the lens of journalism remembered them. And this gives us a clue as to the social values of what makes work meaningful. I'm just going to share one portrait for each of the three other categories to illustrate how we can find meaning in that which we love. The fiancée of Dennis Mojica, a firefighter, said of him, it was his dream, it was his life, it was his first love, she said of firefighting. I admired him even more because he knew what he was here for in this life. He really knew. That which you're good at. In the portrait of Diana O'Connor, a managing director at one of the hardest hit trading firms, Sandler O'Neill, becoming a managing director, rising to this level, was a triumph in at least two ways. Certainly it was an accomplishment born of gritty determination, working 3 jobs. The former Diana Vega, the 15th of 16 children from a Brooklyn family, was one of only 2 of them to attend college. Then she pressed on to graduate school and realized career success. And that which you can be paid for. This is Juan Ortega Campos. He was a delivery boy for a restaurant near the World Trade Center, happened to be making a delivery when the attacks occurred. In Wall Street's swirl of power and money, he was just a delivery boy, a young man with a heavy Spanish accent who carried meals up to the suits working in the World Trade Center. So I'm going to pause for a moment because we're all delivered food in our society where convenience is a priority. And sometimes we don't even look the people who are delivering our food in the face. And so to those whose food he was delivering, Juan Ortega Campos might have been just a delivery boy, but he was saving money for his family back in Mexico. So the rest of his portrait goes like this. But back home in Huanacanapec in central Mexico, Juan Ortega Campos was the very picture of success. A hardworking adventurer who lived in America, called his family every day, and sent back money to build a dream. I don't know what is inspiring if that's not inspiring. The idea that somebody who is often looked upon demeaningly as just a delivery boy was actually doing something heroic, taking care of his family, taking care of a dream that he and his family held, that he personally may not have realized, but that he helped his family realize. And I hope that kind of inspiring story can help you think about and discover your meaningful work. The question before you now is a question about if we have the means to do it, do we have to do meaningful work? Do we owe it not only to others to do work, to do that which the world needs, but do we owe it to ourselves? And I'm not going to go into the deep philosophical arguments that I've thought about to answer that question, but I'm just going to ask you to think about that question for yourself. If you can do meaningful work, do you owe it to yourself? Do you owe it to others to do meaningful work? Instead of going into my long philosophical arguments, I'm going to give you one final argument for why we should do meaningful work. And it's a happier story about the World Trade Center than the sad stories that I've told. And the answer to the question, why should we do meaningful work, in the words of Philippe Petit, a wire walker, is that there is no why. Here's a scene from a film, Man on Wire, about a day in, I think it was 1974, 1975, when Philippe Petit, with some friends of his, accomplished a great feat of civil disobedience. They snuck their way up to the top of the World Trade Center, and they hid their equipment and strung a wire across between the 2 towers for Philippe Petit to walk across. And I want you to listen to how he talks about this feat and about how his friend and his wife, both of whom were there that day, talk about that feat. And you're going to see Italian subtitles. If you can't understand his French and you can't understand the Italian subtitles, still, you'll be able to understand what they're saying about his work.
To step on that one. And on the other hand, something that I could not resist, and I didn't make any effort to resist, called me upon that cable. And death is very close. I start walking as a wire walker who is studying his cable. And instead of doing an entire study of the cable for the whole lens, seeing the first cavity and keep walking, seeing the middle, which is so soft and treacherous, seeing the second cavity, how it is, no, I do only go to the first cavity and I know enough. Now I'm going to perform.
I saw his face changing. He was very tense, and all of a sudden there was something like a relief in him. And from that time I thought, that's it. He's secure, it's good. And wow, that's...
J'ai vu Philippe là, oui, c'était extraordinaire. C'était tellement, tellement beau.
I'll pause it there. I will recommend this film, Man on Wire. It's a beautiful story, but if you caught the expressions of his wife in awe of the beauty and in just incredibleness, if that's a word, of his feet, and his friend who broke down in tears, remembering years later his great feat. I'm not suggesting that your meaningful work that you should go out and discover is something as risky as wire walking, but I am suggesting that discovering something that matters so much to us that work seems to us to be a great relief when we get out there on that wire to perform it would be a great gift and a great improvement over the meaningless work that so many of us seem to have to perform on these Monday through Friday sorts of dying. When Philippe Petit came off of the wire, that was the only time they could arrest him because none of the officers were willing to dare going out on the wire to handcuff him. And reporters and police officers kept asking him, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And he said, for something like this, I don't have to answer why. There is no why. So with that, I am going to leave you to think about the question of what is your meaningful work? Do you have to do it? How can you find it? Why should you do it? And we will open it up for conversation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Michaelson. Very thought-provoking. I guess anyone can submit their questions using the Q&A function in the software you're using right now. Our first question I would ask, even though you just said you'd leave it to someone to figure out how they come up with their meaningful work, what are some of the questions that someone could ask themselves to help get to the bottom of all of those questions, different motivations, and help find that meaningful work to them?
Thanks, Jacob. So when I was showing those Venn diagrams, I discounted their usefulness in a way because they all suggested that meaningful work was something so narrow that you pretty much had to hit a bullseye every time in order to discover it. But I'm also suggesting that maybe you can find aspects of meaning in many different kinds of work, not just the perfect job. And so I do think that those kinds of questions implied by those diagrams can be useful starting points for finding your meaningful work. So what are you good at, for example? We don't always love what we're good at, by the way. I'm better at math than I am at reading and writing, but I prefer to read and write than to do math problems. But it helps to be good at something because that helps to get paid to do it. Of course, I'm pretty good at juggling 3 balls, but nobody's ever going to pay me to juggle because I can't juggle 4. So being good at something isn't going to guarantee that you're going to get paid to do it. It also has to be something that the world needs. The world doesn't need me to juggle 3 tennis balls. It needs me to juggle maybe 7 swords, which I can't do. Swords on fire, even better. Of course, it's nice to be able to do something that we love, but it's also nice, and think about St. Thomas, it's also nice to do something that the world needs, to do something that serves the common good. And a philosopher would suggest that serving the common good perhaps ought to be something that we love to do. So if you can find something that the world needs, that you're good at, good enough at to get paid for, to do it, then maybe that can be something that you love. Again, that seems perhaps like a tall order. And so looking for all of that in one job, I don't think necessarily should be somebody's goal, but rather looking for those things over the course of a career, which might be comprised of many jobs, might be a more realistic goal and more attainable.
Okay, and do you have any recommendations in terms of further reading or resources that might help people think about this more and answer those questions for themselves?
As my students know, I love to assign lots of reading, and even though I teach primarily in a business school, I love to assign novels and short stories because I think that they engage our imagination maybe better than business bestsellers. You can find lots of books in any airport bookstore about how to find your calling, how to find meaningful work, how to drive your passions at work, and so on. And I think most of them sort of go in one ear and out the other. But the kinds of stories that might stick with you are literary stories. So one of my favorites is by maybe, in some people's estimation, the world's greatest novelist in history, Leo Tolstoy, most famous for War and Peace and Anna Karenina. He has a shorter novel called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's about 100 pages long, and it's about a lawyer who's always looking for the next promotion, always looking for the next raise, and lives wrong, and so dies wrong. And that's, of course, a very thought-provoking tale in which we might recognize ourselves, our neighbors, our colleagues. Another favorite of mine, a novel that is about boredom at work, is by David Foster Wallace. It's called The Pale King. And it was a novel that was left unfinished at the time of David Foster Wallace's tragic death, but it is still worth reading in its 600-page entirety. But there's one chapter, chapter 22, that's about 100 pages long, that can be read as sort of a novel unto itself. And it's about Chris Vogel, an employee at the IRS, explaining how he came to find his meaningful work, his calling in tax accounting. And I find that incredibly funny because I've worked with a lot of accountants and I've taught a lot of accountants, and I still don't understand how somebody could find their calling in tax accounting. So there's a little bit of a joke there, but there's also real substance there about how one can find their calling in that line of work. So those are 2 recommendations at least.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Another question, Someone says, I think many people shy away from their identified meaningful work for financial reasons. Do you have suggestions for how to balance meaningful work with financial need?
Yeah, that's a really good point and a good question. And I think that in our society, where our technology is governed by ones and zeros and our government is governed by a two-party system of reds and blues, we have a tendency to sort of look at things in binary ways, either or. So either I find meaningful work or I find monetarily rewarding work. It's meaning or money. And as I always teach my students, when we're between a rock and a hard place, where neither option is a good option, maybe we need to do better than to identify two options. Maybe there's a third option that reconciles meaning and money. Maybe it's not as meaningful as the most meaningful thing we could imagine doing. Maybe it's not as monetarily rewarding as the most lucrative thing we could imagine doing, but maybe there is a path where you can survive and find meaning in your work. I think it's important not to think about meaning and money as a trade-off, and to think about how they can be reconciled, whether in one job or, as I said earlier, perhaps over time. That said, I don't mean to completely discount the idea that there is a trade-off. It's been found that people who are calling oriented, meaning they are looking for the most meaningful work possible and are idealistically willing to sacrifice other things, often do experience a dark side of meaningful work or of calling. There's a pretty well regarded academic paper about zookeepers, for example, who are poorly paid, don't have a whole lot of social status. They work with, well, animals and the things that animals produce. And it's a tough way to make a living, but zookeepers do it often for the love of it. Musicians as well. A few musicians are going to make it big. More musicians will be starving artists. And it's been suggested that calling-oriented musicians sometimes think they are better at music than they actually are, which is why they might continue to persist. And that's inspiring in a way, but it's also a challenge in a way.
Okay. And do you think that employers are making changes in the workplace in recognition of the importance of meaningful work to engagement?
So I spent a lot of my career in management consulting, as I suggested, and the firm that I spent a lot of my career with was doing quite a bit in order to try to attach to the interests of especially emerging generations of workers who may, some social studies suggest, care more about meaning than prior generations, at least when it comes to work. And so the firm that I worked with was articulating its purpose statement, and many other organizations are articulating a new mission or purpose in an attempt to explain why what they do matters and how their conception of what matters connects to their potential employees or their customers' perceptions of what matters. So yeah, I do think that there's a lot more talk about this topic among today's employers, and I think that some of it is meaningful discussion about meaningful work. Some of it is marketing discussion about meaningful work. And I think each of us has to figure out what is our meaningful work, whether the statements of purpose of our potential employers align with our vision of meaningful work and align with what they're actually doing in the world.
Okay. Next question would be, any tips for someone who has found meaningful work, but there are day-to-day annoyances, tough colleagues, workload that are, these annoyances are hard to set aside. How do you remind yourself of the meaning behind your work and keep focused on that on a day-to-day basis?
I've had jobs like that too. So I can definitely relate. In fact, the work that I was doing on 9/11, I would describe somewhat similarly in that I was working for a really cool client that was lending money to important economic development projects around the world, and needed to be doing so in a way that was not corrupt, that was really serving the interests of those in need. And so part of my team's work was to ensure that they were lending money in a non-corrupt way. And that required us to do not just annoying work, but incredibly boring, detailed work where we were comparing long lists of investments to long lists of investment holdings and mutual funds and so on, in order to ensure that there were not conflicts of interest among the lenders. It was important work, but it was soul-crushing work if you didn't have that bigger purpose in mind. And so, as I think the questioner suggested, having that big purpose in mind is the number one most important thing. But I can't say that I succeeded as a manager in convincing the employees who are working for me on that project that spending hours on end, traveling away from home, working in a windowless conference room where we didn't have a whole lot of interaction with our client personnel and we weren't all that welcome there. I didn't necessarily convince them that the big purpose was worth the small purpose. And I think that maybe, as I think out loud, that's part of an answer to this questioner's question. If there's a trade-off between the big purpose and the small annoyances, you have to figure out if that trade-off is worth it. It reminds me of one other thing too. I've talked a little bit about the dark sides of meaningful work, such as the material sacrifices that are sometimes made. Another dark side is that sometimes in the name of purpose, people will cut corners in order to achieve that important big picture goal at the expense of maybe a smaller goal. And that's not the ideal of meaningful work either. It shouldn't be a trade-off between big purpose and little annoyances. Hopefully they can balance out.
So this is probably our last question here, as we're running out of time, but you kind of touched on it already in terms of, as from a management perspective, either giving people meaningful work or reminding them of the meaning in their work. Sometimes you said for some organizations, it's a little more marketing than actual altruism, I guess. So how, from a management perspective, would someone authentically implement, a process to give people meaningful work or remind them of that meaning?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because that's an important question that I really didn't focus much on. But a lot of the work that's out there is provided by an institution, a work institution, a government institution. And those providers also have the opportunity to protect meaningful work or not to protect it. Meanwhile, this question on the screen, do we have to do meaningful work, is a personal choice in a sense, if that choice is available to us. Should we pursue meaningful work, and should we practice it if it is provided to us and protected for us? But I haven't actually defined meaningful work clearly in the course of this conversation. I've sort of assumed that people have a sense of what it might be. And it's important to define it if you think about this question of what are management's obligations, because management's definition of meaningful work might be different than my definition of meaningful work. So they might think they're providing meaningful work to me that I don't find all that meaningful. Or they might try to deceive me into thinking that the work is meaningful through their marketing efforts. In my definition, meaningful work is something that ideally we experience as meaningful. So it feels meaningful to us. It feels like it's satisfying what we have a passion for. It's also something that is justifiably meaningful. So I have some academic colleagues who call these two perspectives on meaningful work a realization perspective, meaning I help realize myself through this work, and my work is justified in some way as doing some good for the world. And then I have a third component that I add to that. Is it really good for the world? Am I just rationalizing that it's good for the world, or is it really good for the world? And I think management has to satisfy those questions if it's going to be a provider of meaningful work. How does it justify that work? How is it genuinely good for the world? And how is it experienced by our workers?
All right, it's a lot to think about.
It is a lot.
But thank you so much, Dr. Michaelson, for sharing your thoughts with us today. It's been great. And thank you to everyone out there who tuned in. I hope you all picked up something that you can use in your own work or help you find meaningful work.
And can I just say, have a good weekend, but I also hope that you have a happy Monday.
Yes, sounds great. We're going to take a little hiatus with our webinars for a while. But we will be back in September. I hope you all look out for it in the next academic year for us and join us then. Thanks.
Thank you.